Hey friends, welcome to this week of The Biggest Story. We're going to review chapter 6 from last week, and then we will do this week's chapter, which is chapter 7. So last week we talked about all the kings because the Israelites just seemed to not really listen to God, and they wanted to be just like all of the people around them, so they decided they needed a king. And so God finally said, okay, fine, I'll give you a king. So he gave them King Saul first, which everybody thought he was going to be a great king, and he proved to be human, and he messed up. So then the next king that was anointed was King David. He was anointed as a young child. He grew up, and he was a pretty good leader. He did some really great things, but he was also human, so he did some bad things. So then next up on the throne was his son, Solomon. And we hear about Solomon and how wise he was and all the great things he did. But even like the king before him and his dad proved that he was still human and he was going to fall as well. So we learn that the kingdom actually divided into Israel in the north and Judah in the south. There was a divided kingdom. The Israelites weren't even united as people. And it just didn't look good, right? They had been kicked out of the promised land, similar to how we saw Adam and Eve kicked out of the garden because Adam and Eve disobeyed God. Well, the Israelites were disobeying God as well. They were kicked out of the promised land, and it was just not a good time. So now we're going to start with chapter 7 and see what happens next. So we just learned that it just wasn't looking good for the Israelites. But it says, believe it or not, God's promises hadn't gone anywhere. In fact, God kept on making more promises all the time. God promised that the snake crusher, Abraham's child, Judah's lion, and David's son would come from Bethlehem. God promised he would be born of a virgin. God promised a messenger to prepare the way. God promised that the deliverer would die and live again and be a light to the nations. And God promised lots of amazing things. But Israel was too busy disobeying God's commands, and ignoring God's warnings to notice. God sent miraculous prophets like Elijah and Elisha, and rebuking prophets like Amos and Malachi, and sad prophets like Jeremiah, and good news prophets like Isaiah. It didn't matter which ones God sent or how many. The people never listened. Not for very long anyways. And so one day, it happened. God stopped sending the prophets. No more warnings, no more direction, no more word from the Lord. Only silence for 400 years. God had sent prophets, priests, and kings. He started out with Adam and started over with Noah. He chose Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He gave Moses the law. He sent Israel judges. He raised up deliverers. He conquered enemies. He provided sacrifices. He lived among his people in a tent and in a temple. God gave them every opportunity and 10,000 chances. But still, sin and the serpent seemed to be winning until all of a sudden they lost. And if you know the story, what happens next and how sin and the serpent were crushed, then you know what next week's going to be about. But here's a sneak peek at next week about what we're going to do for chapter 8. So I hope that y'all have a great week. I hope you enjoyed this week's chapter, and I will see y'all next week.